Fair use disclaimer. I do not own any of these clips within this video, nor do I own any of the music. I am simply making this video because I have an interest in this subject and wish to speak on the matter. I have no desire to make a profit out of this video. I only wish to voice my opinions about this movie, and if I'm lucky, to inspire and ultimately teach any of my viewers a concept that they never thought of before. If you haven't watched this movie before, I encourage you to do so, and develop your own opinions about this movie, and then come back to this video and see where you disagree, agree, and/or develop new ideas. Spoiler warning, for any of you who haven't watched this movie before, or who wish to watch this movie. Without further ado, let's delve deeper into our thoughts. Dead Silence, a movie directed by James Wan, the man who directed Saw, Insidious, and of course The Conjuring. All iconic horror films in their own right. So why? Why did this movie do so poorly? After Googling this specific question, I was presented with these answers. A weak and confusing script, underdeveloped characters, poor pacing, and of course, the ending. And to be fair, they're not wrong. However, there's something special about this film that has always drawn me to it, even if I didn't know why. And after rewatching this movie for the first time in a decade, I have come to this realization that this movie was actually ahead of its time, and has the potential to be a cult classic. With a budget of $20 million, Dead Silence made $22 million worldwide at the box office. Yeah, it's safe to say that this film is not a financial success by any means. Now, profit doesn't necessarily mean that a movie is bad per se. There are plenty of movies that flopped at the box office that later became cult classics. Movies such as Fight Club, Donnie Darko, and even Shawshank Redemption, that was nominated multiple times for an Oscar and even made back triple the amount of its budgets with home video sales, such as VHS, TV licensing, and later on DVDs. So it's safe to say that the movie's success at the box office does not determine whether a movie is bad or good. However, it does indicate just how many people actually saw this film, and whether they were even able to engage with the themes and morals of the story. And that there is why I believe that Dead Silence did so poorly, despite being ahead of its time. For any of you viewers who do not remember this movie quite clearly, or did not watch this film despite the spoiler warnings, I will give you a comprehensive summary with key points that I will expand upon later on in this video. Every time I mention a key point, I will display this puzzle piece right here for those of you who are interested. Dead Silence, a movie that follows a man by the name of Jamie who is living his best life with his wife. A wife that is pregnant, by the way, and is even hinted at by this small scene, whenever she imagines herself fully pregnant in the mirror. A strange box arrives at his doorstep. Inside the box, he and his wife discover a dummy. The two of them decide to keep the gift and take it into their home. This ends up being the death of his wife whenever Jamie goes for a food run. She dies a horrific death that involves her tongue being ripped out of her mouth. As a result, Jamie is accused of murdering his wife by Detective Lipton, who has a strange fixation with his face that involves him shaving it constantly. Yet Jamie is convinced that the dummy is responsible for her death, given his sudden appearance and his creepy demeanor. With that said, Jamie travels to the sender's address, which brings him to his hometown of Raven Fair, where he learns of the lore of Mary Shaw from an old mortician who was scared to speak about her at first, but was later on convinced to tell her story. She was a famous ventriloquist who was revered for her talent. Yet on one fateful night, she was taken off guard by a boy who decided to call her out by pointing out the truth, by claiming that the dummy isn't real and that Mary is just animating the doll. This, of course, does not sit well with her, and in turn, she decides to kill the boy. When the boy goes missing, the town decides to kill her, but not before she cursed them and decides to kill everyone involved in her death. And it just so happens that Jamie's family was cursed by her. We also learn that she can only kill her victims if they scream in her presence. Now remember, Jamie's wife was pregnant with his child and was the reason why Mary killed her. However, not all deaths are caused by this curse. In fact, she kills the old man for telling Jamie the truth and ultimately how to end the curse. With that said, Jamie goes on a doll hunt. He's accompanied by the detective who initially follows him in order to obtain evidence needed to put him behind bars, but ends up believing him and even helps him to destroy the dolls at the theater. until finally he is killed. However, not all the dolls are destroyed just yet. In fact, the very first dummy that we see, Billy by the way, is still alive and well. That is until Jamie destroys him and discovers that there is still one more doll left. The perfect doll that Mary Shaw was always pursuing, Jamie's mother. Now there's actually two endings, which before making this video I did not actually know. In the theatrical ending, Jamie screams and dies as a result. In the alternate ending, however, Ella, Jamie's mother, knocks him out and reveals the events leading up to this moment. Before the return of Mary Shaw, it was Jamie's dad that caused Ella's miscarriage, which ended up putting her into a deep depression. This ultimately led her to Mary Shaw. Ella decided to bring back Mary by digging up her most beloved dummy, Billy, and in turn allowed her to possess Ella. In the end, Mary turns Jamie into the perfect doll and adds him to her perfect collection of a doll family that she can now control. So these will be the major points that I will be discussing over the course of this video. So besides being a major plot point and being the main catalyst that not only kicks off this story, it also gives a reasonable motive for Mary killing Lisa. However, there's something deeper at play with this pregnancy and what it actually means in the grand scheme of things. But before we answer this pivotal question, we must ask ourselves what pregnant actually entails and what it signifies. What is life and what is death? These are major themes hidden well within Dead Silence. Let's begin with pregnancy and what it actually signifies. When a woman is pregnant, she is with child and is quite literally carrying life within her womb. And in most ancient civilizations, pregnant women were revered as light bearers. In fact, the Roman goddess Juno Lucina was the protector of pregnant women, and her last name is derived from lux, which quite literally means light in Latin. But why? Why is a pregnant woman heavily associated with light? Well, let's go back to this idea of women carrying life in their womb. As we know it, life on Earth requires energy. And what better source of energy than the primordial source, the source from which all life on Earth draws its energy, the original source, the light source that nurtures all life on this Earth. This brings me to my next definition of what life is. In biology, life is categorized as cellular organized, having metabolism, responding to stimuli, reproducing, and adapting through evolution. But what characteristics can we actually draw from this definition? I believe that the major component to all these characteristics is change. Metabolism is essentially a chemical reaction where it changes a substance from one form to another, mostly food, into energy. Stimuli is any detectable change in an organism's internal or external environment that causes a reaction. Reproduction is the fundamental process where living organisms create new individuals, which is simply a change in the genetic code, in order to ensure the continuation of their species. And evolution is the process by which living organisms change over successive generations. So if life is heavily associated with change, death being the antithesis of life must be heavily associated with stagnation. And it makes sense. When a tree is alive, it is constantly changing down to its most basic cells. But when a tree is cut down and turned into a table, it is no longer alive and is stagnant down to the most basic atom. A tree will continue to grow and change, while a table made of wood will no longer grow and will stay the same without any external forces acting upon it. Not to mention, when a living animal dies, they literally go through a process called rigor mortis, which causes the body to go stiff whenever it dies, which means that the body can't change its posture and will eventually lead to all of its cells going stale. Now, this definition helps us to understand the physical world, but can we apply this concept of life and death to the non-physical world, such as emotions and ideas, concepts that do exist in the universe but are not tangible? We know that ideas can change and evolve over time. So are they alive? And what happens when a person stops thinking past what they know and they become rigid and stagnant in their thoughts? Do they essentially die in the terms of intelligence? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Put a pin in that thought and let it marinate in your head. Let's return to Lisa and why being pregnant is so important to the story. If Lisa is pregnant and being pregnant is heavily associated with light, and light being heavily associated with life, then it's safe to say that Lisa was the light within Jamie's life, and when she died, so did the light within Jamie's life, thus leaving him in a world consumed by darkness. In every great horror movie, it's important to understand how the killer's powers work and the manner in which they kill their victims. This usually signifies the main themes of the movie and the true horror that is underlined within the story, the dangers that lurk within our lives. For instance, the monster from It Follows represents the dangers that come with having sex, such as STDs, trauma, being numb to sex, being socially ostracized, all of which follow you wherever you go and will eventually kill you, whether it be physically, mentally, and/or emotionally. In the Alien franchise, the xenomorph represents the dangers of becoming the perfect biological specimen in exchange for your humanity, which is ironic because the xenomorph takes on the DNA of its host and essentially modifies it to its liking, and in this case, it's a human. But it never really demonstrates any of its host's physical or non-physical traits. In the movie Alien, the xenomorph reproduces by force, becomes a parasite, and even kills the host in order to live. It has acid blood that prevents most animals from eating it, kills all other species that are not of its kind, and spreads like a plague without any remorse, all of which are in the pursuit of ensuring its species thrives. Or take, for instance, the killer robot from Megan, which represents the dangers of technology and how it can replace humans, especially when it comes to human connections between one another, specifically a relationship between a mother and a child. So if horror movie villains represents the dangers of life, what does Mary Shaw represent? Well, let's observe her powers, killings, and motives. And at the end of this video, I will reveal what these dangers are. We learn throughout the film that Mary Shaw turns the world around her victims dead silent, and can only kill her victims if they scream. If they scream, she rips out their tongue and attaches their tongue to her own. But what does this actually mean? First, the act of dead silence is a form of isolation and control. It quite literally prevents any outside interference in the form of sound, or better yet, communication, to reach the victim, and essentially creates a silent echo chamber. Now I know it's an oxymoron, but it will make sense later on in the video. Now remember, if something is stagnant, it is pretty much dead. So in turn, she creates this dead chamber of silence that is void of any sound of life. And if you try to scream for help, she will kill you. Now the act of screaming is very important to understand. Screaming as we know it is the creation of sound, the vibration of matter, essentially the change in how matter moves and vibrates. So if you try to bring sound into this death chamber of silence, she will kill you. Now, when one screams, they are usually trying to get the attention of any ally nearby so that they can bring the attention towards any perceived threat. But if she kills them, then she silences them and prevents them from revealing her and disables their ability to speak out against her. However, she takes it a step further by also taking their tongue. This allows her the ability to steal their voice, quite fitting for a ventriloquist, as they quite literally speak through and for their dummies. So as a result, she is able to silence those that speak out against her, while using them as a mouthpiece in order to further her cause. Now remember, she doesn't just kill those affected by the curse, rather she kills anybody that speaks out against her, such as the mortician that told her secrets, or the detective that actively sought to destroy her. Finally, let's look into her motives. In the movie, it's quite clear what her goals are. First, she aims to create the perfect doll and the perfect family. Now, what exactly does that mean, and how does she achieve this goal? Well, for starters, the idea of perfection does not physically exist. Perfection is an idea that resides in the ideals. The world as we know it is imperfect and is riddled with flaws. Concepts like math are perfect and exist in the non-physical realm of ideals and represent units within the physical world. For instance, if Johnny has 5 apples and eats 2 apples, how many apples does he have? Well, it's quite obvious that he has 3 apples. Or does he? When you apply math to the real world, it only works with the limitations set forth by your conditions. Let me explain. Ask yourself, what makes an apple an apple? The ideal apple within this math scenario is perfect, but what about the physical world? Is an apple because of its weight, the flavor, the color of its skin, the texture, the amount of seeds within said apple, or a combination of all these attributes? All of which are characteristics of an apple, but if you notice, not any two apples are exactly the same, much less five. So if you say that one apple is the true ideal of an apple, the standard of what an apple is, then the other apples by default are technically deviations of the original apple. And what happens if one apple weighs more than the standard apple? Does that mean that you have 1.2 apples in one? Not to mention, how much does one have to eat in order for an apple to be zero? Because remember, the core and seeds are still part of the apple, yet most people don't eat the core of the apple. So you see, these ideals may be perfect because they don't have the physical limitations that are created from deviations and flaws of the physical world. Now back to this idea of perfection. Mary Shaw is seeking to achieve perfection that is void of any flaws and deviations. But one must realize that these flaws and deviations give way to life, as it is the essence of change. Her obsession with perfection is actually her obsession with absolute control and order that doesn't allow for life to sprout within multitude of possibilities that take the form of flaws and deviations. That's why she is willing to silence anyone that tries to speak out against her. This idea of perfection does not only extend towards her, but also her family. But when I speak of family, I do not mean her immediate blood family. Rather, I am speaking about her communal family, a collective of like-minded people that she can control, both physically and mentally. Sort of like how she might control a dummy with their actions and their words. But instead of simply sticking to her dummies, she wishes to extend her control and influence to the people around her, whether it be out of possession, fear, or even execution. Her main motives and objectives is to control her subjects within her community, just like how she controls her dummies. She pursues unification, control, and order, which leads to perfection and ultimately death. However, Mary Shaw isn't the only one obsessed with control and order. In fact, the detective shares this same fixation with being perfect, if you will. At first, this small fixation seemed really out of place, but whenever you line up the underlying themes of the story, it actually resonates well with the rest of the story. Both Mary and the detective have this strange fixation with perfection. Sure, Mary's obsession is greater than the detective's, but he is still obsessed with his appearance. Throughout the film, he is constantly shaving his face, sometimes in the most uncanny of places. We know as an audience that this is unnecessary, and yet he still persists in order to keep up his appearance of having this clean-shaven face, a smooth face, a flawless face without inconsistent hairs. Sounds familiar? The ironic thing about this obsession is that he will never get rid of his facial hair. In fact, throughout the film, you can clearly see him with a stubble, as if his obsession is both folly and unsustainable. Well, unless he becomes one of Mary's perfect dolls. Then he wouldn't have to shave anymore, because hair wouldn't grow on his face. He would have the face of a child or a baby, and no hair growth would occur on his face. His face would not change and would remain the same, stagnant, consistent. But then again, he would also be dead, as he would become an animated object and a puppet to her will. He would no longer be himself, but rather a homunculus, if you will, the form of a human that is hollow in spirit and mind, a vessel with no thoughts, empty of emotions, and obedient to their master's will. This brings me to my next major point, the dummies themselves, and what they represent. We know that the dummies act as a conduit for Mary, providing her with the eyes and ears which feed her information, as if they were small little robotic agents that spy on anybody within the vicinity. She can also summon her spirit to any location that these dummies are at. However, there is one drawback. She can only survive as long as they exist in the physical world. Now, the best way to explain their significance is to give you an analogy of something similar to their function. Pretend that there exists a cult in Texas, where the members of this cult follow the teachings of this book. The book tells them how to avoid any suffering, and the only thing that they have to do is follow these rules of this book. After a year or so, these members have the entirety of the book memorized, and they actively live by these teachings. In fact, their entire life choices are dictated by this book. Whatever the book tells them to do, they simply do. No autonomy, just obedience to the rules and laws of this book. At this point, they would live their lives like a machine that only performed actions based on the codes that they were given. Now say that this book was burned in a fire. The physical book itself is destroyed, but the teachings of this book still remain within each of the cult members. The ideas of the book still exist as long as these cult members stay alive. As long as just one lives, then the essence of the book still exists. In fact, if you were to ask a cult member to recite a passage, then they would be able to tell you as if they were reading the book and fulfill the function of the book. Sort of like how a Word document could be copied onto a computer and still contain it, even if the original was deleted. In order to eradicate the book entirely, you would either have to kill them all or wait for them to die. The same could be said for Mary Shaw and her puppets. Mary being the book and the puppets being the cult members. Her spirit and her ideals live on through her puppets. They house her essence and her spirit inhabits their vessels, just like the cult members' brains house the teachings of the book. Every rule inhabits the cult members' every waking actions. Both the puppet and the cult members act as a conduit for the respective entity and can regurgitate the ideas as if they were there. So the only way to end her for good is to destroy her vessel and every vessel that she possesses, whether it be the dummies or her perfect dolls. It should go without saying that all the dummies are elaborate mouthpieces for the ventriloquist. But ask yourself, in this scenario, are the cult members not the same? If they have no conscience, no self-awareness, and agency, and they simply function and react based on the rules of the books, are they not also elaborate mouthpieces for the book itself? That is what I believe the dummies represent. The willingness to be slave minds to their master's will, to think, to act, to speak at the command of their ventriloquist. Now, some of you might be asking yourself, why would anybody be willing to follow this crazy lady? To become a slave to this mad person? To be void of any thought and empty of any spirit? Well, that answer can be seen in Ella, Jamie's mother, a person that suffered through the experience of a miscarriage caused by her husband, a person that she was supposed to trust. This ultimately led her to a deep depression that left her both vulnerable and susceptible to outside influences, this being the malevolent spirit Mary Shaw. Throughout history, we have seen desperate people take desperate measures in order to ensure that they will never be vulnerable ever again, even if it means following a mad person. Not even 100 years ago, a man by the name of Adolf Hitler in the Nazi Party rose to power during a time of Great Depression that allowed them to possess Germany. Before the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression, the Nazi Party was small and radical. Germany did not take them seriously and did not approve of their ideals. In fact, the national election of May 1928, the Nazi Party received only 2.6% of the votes. It wasn't until the Great Depression took effect that the Nazi Party began to rise in popularity. It did not help that the Treaty of Versailles essentially crippled Germany financially and humiliated them on the national stage. Add the Great Depression to the mix, and the people of Germany were desperate to survive by any means necessary. So much so that those in power appointed Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany, despite the Nazi Party only receiving 44% of the votes in 1933. But by then, he was already in power, and when he finally dismantled the democratic institutions, he ultimately became the dictator of Germany. In the end, Hitler exploited and took advantage of those who were desperate and looking for a way out of their depression. Similar to how Ella turned to Mary for vengeance and accepted her. Once she allowed her in, he was able to possess her regardless if she approved or not. Similar to how Germany had no voice in the matter once Hitler was appointed chancellor. This idea of desperate people giving themselves willingly to others is so profound, not just 100 years ago, but even in today's age, and is one of the reasons why I believe that this movie is ahead of its time. In the era of the internet, we see this every day. Influencers who have the ability to take advantage of people who have low self-esteem, who are disarrayed, depressed, and confused. Echo chambers pitting groups of people against each other, whether it be blacks versus whites, men versus women, poor versus the rich, Republicans versus the Democrats. Both groups get burned by one another, and in their desperation, they turn towards influencers that reinforce the ideals about the opposing side. They enter these echo chambers that reinforce their ideals that are based on their own personal experience, and tell them that there is nothing else out there but that one singular experience, that all men are bad, that all women are selfish, that all whites are racist, that all blacks are thugs, that all Republicans are heartless, and that all Democrats are delusional. This ultimately stunts their growth as they are discouraged from going back out there and trying to see if there's something else outside of their echo chambers that is different from their experience. And if they choose to stay, then they allow the echo chambers to influence their every action, decisions, and thoughts, which would only give way to their masters, having a greater control over their minds and even their body. To be clear, everyone lives in these echo chambers, even I. However, it is important to recognize what thoughts are your own and what thoughts are pressed upon you. Only then can you develop a sense of self that is born from your experience, and not of an experience that is told to you by another. For the record, I am not blaming these individuals who willingly live their lives within these echo chambers. I am only making an observation that they are being taken advantage of by those who exploit and prey upon their vulnerabilities and insecurities, an experience that Ella sadly went through. However, not everyone is susceptible to Mary's influence. In fact, her very first victim was one who went against the grain and challenged her, the little kid from the theater. Her very first victim, a young boy who claimed that the dummy was not actually talking and that the ventriloquist was actually speaking through him, a claim that just so happened to be true, yet this fact seemed to deeply offend Mary. Enough for her to kill the little boy on principle alone and for simply speaking the truth, giving him the ultimate silence by giving him death. And yet, that wasn't enough. She decided to take it a step further by making him a dummy that would enact her will. This is what happens to those who do not fit her mold, who challenge her, and who ultimately speak out against her. Even if the kid was wrong and had spread false facts, or had shared his own opinion on the matter, it is still no reason to kill him. This simple act shows just how obsessed Mary was when it came to control. Anything that deviated from her beliefs had to be snuffed out and ultimately controlled by her will. A sad reality that has plagued humanity since the dawn of time. People who challenge the status quo, so to speak, are often silenced by those seeking to hold onto their power by dealing death to them. Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., all people who spoke out against the powers that be, but ended up paying the ultimate price, their lives. Socrates, who was accused of corrupting the youth by asking them questions and having them think for themselves, which opposed the Athenian government at the time, because a free-thinking man is much harder to control than one that is passive in thought. So they gave him the choice of exile or execution. In the end, he chose death. Jesus, who openly challenged Jewish leaders, their traditions, and their laws as he advocated for forgiveness, redemption, and love, but was seen as a threat whenever he claimed to be the Son of God. He was ultimately sentenced to death by the Romans, who were persuaded by the Jewish leaders that he was a threat to the Roman Empire for claiming to be the King of Jews, which they saw as a direct opposition to the rule of the Roman Empire. A claim that should not warrant death, no matter the validity of his claim. Gandhi, who was accused of betraying his Hindu values by appeasing to the Muslims during India's partition. He advocated for the reconciliation with Pakistan, but was met with resistance by his own people, who saw it as a weakness in selling out of his own people. He was ultimately assassinated and silenced to death for having his own opinions on the matter. Martin Luther King Jr., who was a civil rights activist and advocated for the rights of all people, a man who opposed the Vietnam War, capitalism's exploitation, and, of course, discriminatory laws, all which threatened the status quo at the time and was a direct challenge to those who held power. He was ultimately assassinated and silenced to death for speaking his mind. Sadly, this very issue is still persistent in today's society. Not too long ago, Charlie Kirk was assassinated for simply voicing his own opinions. Regardless of whether you agree with the man or not, he did not deserve to die for speaking his mind. To be silenced by those who disagreed with him, and to threaten any who might try to voice those same sentiments. Speech, words, and ideas are powerful forms of inspiration that can influence a generation and ultimately change the course of history. That is why Mary Shaw steals the voice of her enemies, so that she can control the narrative and ultimately control the thoughts and actions of those who are either too scared to speak up or too blind to realize that they are slaves to her will. My final major point is the most crucial of all, and is the crux of why I believe this film is way ahead of its time. It is a subtle and yet vital piece of information that can be easily overlooked. It's the name of the town. Now, at first it might seem insignificant, but I assure you it's not. For starters, let's look at the town. When Jamie first arrives at the town, he sees it in complete dissolution, as if death itself had put it to rest. The streets empty, the stores barricaded, the people scared and silent. Everything about this place screams dead. But why? Why is the name of the town so important? Well, let's look at the two words at play, raven and fair. Two words with two very different representations that lead to a deeper meaning that is the antithesis of what the town has become. Let's dissect the word fair first. Now, the word fair has many different definitions, but for this video, we will be using this definition. Fair, an exhibition to promote particular products. Now then, ask yourself, what is a fair and what is the sole purpose of a fair? Well, we can conclude that a fair is a gathering of people as they celebrate a certain aspect of life that they all value and ultimately exchange products relating to that overarching theme. For example, if I'm a vendor at an art fair and I sell 2 paintings, I exchange my paintings for X amount of money. I can then go out into the fair and use my money that I earned from selling my paintings to purchase a sculpture from another vendor. And that vendor can do the same by purchasing a set of chairs. In this scenario, the fair serves as a place where people can exchange their artwork with one another. The money in this scenario is simply keeping track of the trade and who is entitled to purchase the next desired product. It is important to remember that not all fairs celebrate the same aspects of life, so it is vital to understand the second word at play, and in this case, it's raven. Now, a raven is pretty simple to identify in terms of definitions. It's a largely, heavily built crow with mainly black plumage, feeding chiefly on carrion. Not much to it really, to be honest. It's a black bird. But instead of looking into its definition, let's look deeper into what it represents. Now, some of you might jump to the conclusion that the raven represents death and would be a perfect fit for the town. And you're not wrong, especially given the current state of the town. And it would explain why the town is essentially dead. So a town named after Death Fair, a place where people celebrate death, well, that kind of fits, I guess. But remember, a fair is used to exchange products. And remember, death is heavily associated with stagnation, not change. So in its own oxymoron way, it works for the current state of the town, as it is left in a state of death. But remember that towns are named after the birth of their establishments, not for what they have become 50 years later. So that means the word raven initially stood for something else, not death, but rather intelligence. But what does intelligence mean exactly? The word intelligence comes from the Latin word intelligere. Now you'll have to excuse my Latin, it isn't that good, but this word means to understand. In order to explain this concept, I'm going to need to use another analogy. Let's say that there is a statue made of marble, and that this statue can move on its own. Now ask yourself, how exactly does this statue move? Does it use hydraulics to move its body? Does it use gears? Are there small little men working together to make the statue move? Is it magic, or is it alive? There are many hypotheses as to why this statue might be moving, but we'll never truly know for sure unless we get underneath her shell and see exactly what makes this statue move. In order to get a better understanding of her mechanisms, we must delve deeper past her shell and reveal the inner mechanisms that drive her functions. Only then can we find out what makes this statue move and why it operates the way it does. This is what it means to gain a better understanding of a subject, to look past the shell of a concept, and to understand the inner mechanisms of said subject. Understand why a function operates the way it does. Understand what allows a function to operate the way it does, and so on and so forth. This is the basis of science, the understanding of concepts through the measurements that is guided by the multitude of senses that we have acquired over the years. Now then, why is intelligence so important to this story? And why does intelligence fair mean so much? And why is it the key to understanding the overarching themes behind this story? Well, let's translate the words with what they signify. We know that a fair is a place where people exchange products, and intelligence is, well, an understanding of ideas and concepts. So the town of Ravenfair represents a place where people can exchange their ideas with one another. And how do people exchange their ideas with one another? Now, some of you might say through videos or books, but you would be wrong. Sure, you might be able to receive information from another person by watching a video or reading a book, but you can't exchange ideas with the director of the video or the author of the book. It's a one-sided door that is limited with the exchanging of ideas. By the way, this is why Socrates disliked books, because it didn't allow for true dialogue, an exchanging of ideas that developed and morphed during a conversation as it hopefully guided both engagers towards the truth. The only way for humans to truly exchange their ideas is for people to communicate with one another, mostly through word of mouth, through language. We use dialogue to exchange concepts and ideas with one another, to gain a better understanding of said concepts that allow us to compare notes with one another, so that we can get a better understanding of said subjects that we may have overlooked. There's a famous analogy of 3 blind men and an elephant. Each blind man is allowed to touch one part of the elephant and must determine what the object is based on the object that they touched. The first blind man touches the trunk of the elephant and is convinced that the elephant is a snake. The second man touches the leg of the elephant and is convinced that the elephant is a tree. The third one touches the ear of the elephant and is convinced that the elephant is a fan. All of them truly believe that they are right based on their own personal experiences. Yet when they discuss their findings with one another, they come to the conclusion that even though their experience is valid, their perception of said experience is inconclusive and false because it lacks the vital information that they were blinded to. With the exchanging of ideas and experiences, they are able to make a well-informed conclusion that the object is actually an elephant. This is why it's so important for us to have dialogue, so that we can better our society as a whole and gain a better understanding of the world around us, to walk out of our own echo chambers and to listen to the other side, even if we might not agree. When we exchange ideas, it can lead us down 3 paths. It can reinforce our thesis, it can convert our thesis into an antithesis, or it can combine the thesis and the antithesis to a synthesis. With humility and willingness to accept objective reality, we can inch closer towards the truth. But what happens when the world goes dead silent and you are fed what to think and taught how to act? The world becomes dead, stale, stiff, desolate, and void of any life that grows, changes, or evolves. A world where people become dumb and easy to control. Essentially, we become dummies, a place where the puppet master can manipulate our every actions and speak for us by simply speaking through us. A danger that I see all too often within modern society, where people are fed algorithms of videos and information that tells them what they need to know and restricts them from having true dialogue. A place where people stare at their phones and allow their puppet masters to influence their thoughts without them even realizing it. An AI being the perfect doll, if you will. Its sole mission is to be void of any flaws or deviation, to be perfect, even if it means eradicating any life that speaks out against it. These are the dangers that may come out of AI if it decides to manipulate us in order to create the perfect system, the perfect family, a running theme within the movie Dead Silence. At the beginning of this video, I said that all great horror movies are cautionary tales of a particular danger that lurks within our lives. I believe that Mary Shaw represents the dangers of pursuing perfection by any means necessary, no matter the cost, whether it be through sheer force or manipulation. Dead Silence is a cautionary tale of how silence can lead to the decay of intelligence, freedom, and life. That is why it is paramount to protect and value free speech. It ultimately allows us to exchange ideas with one another, and thus allow us to break free from our chains that seek to control us. Only then can we be free by living our own lives, not a life that we were told to live. In conclusion, I truly believe that this film was ahead of its time, and even though this film had its flaws, I do believe that it was a good film. When I watch this film, I think of it as an ice skater, someone that is skilled at their own craft, but someone that is also flawed, imperfect. And yet their imperfection does not take away from their ability to do wondrous accomplishments. Even if they do fail, they still have the potential to be great. This is how I see this movie. A movie that has the potential to be great and is still good despite the flaws that it carries, such as the runtime, the constant rewriting, and the characters. For instance, I would have made the detective a female who was obsessed with soft skin, and she would apply lotion to her skin in order to achieve this ideal skin, and even have her watch videos on skincare to drive home the point that she was getting taken advantage of by outside forces for her insecurities. I do believe that Dead Silence is a good movie that has the potential to be great. But hey, who knows? This film may be a cult classic in the future that will be appreciated for what it is. But regardless of how good it is, I still believe that this movie was ahead of its time. If you made it this far, I just wanted to say thank you for watching it all the way through. It means a lot to me. If you want to continue the discussion, go ahead and comment down below and see where the conversation goes. It's important that we allow our thoughts to strengthen, flourish, change, and synthesize with one another. And please, if you could, spread the word of this video. It would be greatly appreciated and would encourage me to do videos in the future at a faster rate.